Today we're going to discuss a topic that's both controversial and deeply impactful: pornography. Whether people acknowledge it or not, pornography has measurable effects on the brain, on dopamine pathways, and on our ability to focus, connect, and experience real-world intimacy. This isn't about morality, it's about neuroscience and psychology. I want to lay out the truth of how pornography shapes behavior, alters reward systems, and influences mental and physical health. By the end of this talk, you'll have a clear understanding of what's really happening when you engage with it, and what you can do to take control of your brain and your life. When we talk about pornography, the first thing we need to understand is that it is not simply entertainment. It's a form of stimulation that interacts directly with the brain's most powerful chemical systems, specifically dopamine. Dopamine is often misunderstood. It's not the molecule of pleasure, but the molecule of motivation and drive. It determines how much effort we're willing to put into something and how much reward we anticipate from an activity. Every time you experience something novel, exciting, or stimulating, dopamine levels rise, and the brain begins to associate that behavior with potential reward. Pornography is uniquely positioned to hijack this system because of its endless novelty and accessibility. Unlike real-world intimacy, which has natural limits and requires effort, pornography provides an unlimited stream of new partners, scenarios, and stimulation at the click of a button. Each time a person consumes pornography, especially when switching between different types or categories, the brain receives repeated surges of dopamine. These spikes are often far greater than those produced by normal, everyday experiences. Over time, this artificial and repeated overstimulation begins to dysregulate the dopamine system. What happens next is crucial to understand. Dopamine operates on a system of peaks and baselines. When dopamine spikes too high, the brain compensates by lowering the baseline, meaning that after watching pornography, a person may feel flat, unmotivated, or even depressed in the hours or days that follow. This isn't because they are broken or weak, it's a biological adjustment. The brain has essentially recalibrated to expect very high levels of stimulation, so normal activities like studying, exercising, or social interaction feel less rewarding. The contrast effect makes ordinary life seem dull compared to the rapid-fire novelty of pornography. This mechanism is similar to what we see in drug addiction. Substances like cocaine, methamphetamine, or opioids produce massive dopamine surges that far exceed natural levels. Pornography doesn't involve a chemical substance, but it leverages the brain's own neurochemistry in a comparable way. The accessibility and variety create a supernormal stimulus, one that the brain was never designed to handle in constant supply. This is why many people report escalating use. What satisfied them at one point no longer produces the same dopamine effect, and so they seek out more extreme or novel content to recapture that original high. The problem is not just what happens during consumption, but how it bleeds into daily life. With repeated exposure, the dopamine system becomes less responsive to ordinary rewards. Relationships may feel less exciting, motivation to pursue long-term goals may weaken, and overall mood regulation suffers. The wiring of the brain begins to shift. Instead of dopamine driving action toward real-life achievements, it becomes anchored to a digital loop of stimulus and release, which over time conditions the brain to expect quick, effortless rewards rather than the delayed gratification that real-world pursuits require. There is also a neuroplastic component to this process. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change and rewire itself in response to experiences. Each time someone engages with pornography, neurons that fire together wire together, creating stronger connections between sexual arousal and digital imagery rather than human connection. This can make real intimacy feel less stimulating or more difficult to engage with because the brain has learned to associate arousal with pixels instead of people. In neuroscience terms, the pathways of sexual reward become reshaped, and with repeated reinforcement, they dominate over natural circuits that would otherwise support healthy motivation and relationships. The hijacking of dopamine by pornography is not just theoretical. Imaging studies using functional MRI scans have shown that the brains of people who consume pornography regularly exhibit changes in the reward system similar to those seen in substance addictions. There are measurable decreases in dopamine receptor availability and changes in brain regions associated with motivation and decision making. This isn't about moral judgment, it's simply the biology of how the brain responds to overstimulation. The human brain is built on a reward system designed to help us survive and thrive. When we pursue food, social connection, or reproduction, dopamine and other neurochemicals guide us toward behaviors that ensure survival and pass on our genes. This reward circuitry is remarkably flexible, meaning it can adapt to new stimuli and experiences, but that flexibility also makes it vulnerable to being reshaped in ways that don't necessarily serve long term health or well-being. Pornography is one of those stimuli that powerfully reshapes the reward system. At its core, the reward system is about prediction and outcome. The brain releases dopamine not only when we achieve something rewarding, but even more so when we anticipate the reward. This anticipation drives motivation and focus, giving us the energy to pursue goals, whether that's studying for an exam, training for a sport, or working toward a career milestone. With pornography, however, the brain learns that reward can be obtained instantly with no effort, no risk of rejection, and no investment in relationship building. Over time, this changes how the brain values effort and what it expects as a reward. Repeated exposure to pornography rewires circuits in the nucleus accumbens, prefrontal cortex, and ventral tegmental area, the core regions responsible for motivation and decision making. Normally, these regions help balance short-term gratification against long-term goals. But when the brain is conditioned by the rapid, high-intensity stimulation of pornography, those circuits adapt to prioritize immediate, low-effort rewards. In practice, this can make it more difficult to stay focused on tasks that require sustained effort and delayed gratification. Activities like studying, exercising, or even engaging in meaningful conversations start to feel less appealing because the brain has been recalibrated to expect constant stimulation and immediate payoff. This shift in reward valuation also affects relationships. Real-world intimacy requires patience, vulnerability, and emotional connection. It does not deliver the same rapid surge of dopamine that pornography provides, especially when novelty is endlessly available online. As a result, the brain may start to perceive genuine relationships as less rewarding, less exciting, or even burdensome compared to the simplicity and speed of digital consumption. This isn't a matter of preference, it's a matter of neural wiring. The circuits that once drove motivation toward human connection become weakened, while the circuits reinforced by pornography become stronger. An important aspect of this rewiring is something neuroscientists call downregulation. When dopamine pathways are overstimulated, the brain reduces sensitivity by lowering receptor density. This means the same behavior that once produced a strong effect no longer feels as stimulating. The brain compensates by pushing the individual to seek out more extreme or more frequent stimuli to achieve the same dopamine response. In the context of pornography, this often manifests as escalating use or the search for novel and more intense content. At the same time, normal life event, eating a good meal, spending time with friends, achieving a goal, no longer produce the same sense of reward. Motivation for everyday activities declines because the baseline of stimulation has shifted. Over time, this altered reward system doesn't just reduce interest in healthy pursuits, it can also generate a chronic sense of dissatisfaction. When the brain is wired to expect high peaks of dopamine, the normal fluctuations of daily life feel flat. That flatness can be misinterpreted as boredom, lack of purpose, or even depression. People may struggle to find energy for school, work, or hobbies because the circuits that once supported those efforts have been overshadowed by circuits trained to expect effortless and extreme stimulation. This is why the concept of neuroplasticity is so critical to this discussion. The brain's ability to rewire is what makes pornography so powerful in shaping behavior, but it also means change is possible. Each exposure strengthens certain pathways while weakening others. When pornography dominates those exposures, it carves deep grooves in the brain's motivational circuitry, guiding thoughts and actions toward short-term digital rewards rather than long-term real-world fulfillment. This rewiring is not subtle. It can be measured in brain scans, observed in behavior, and felt in the erosion of motivation and drive. Human intimacy is built on a delicate interplay between neurochemistry, psychology, and social behavior. In healthy relationships, intimacy develops gradually through communication, vulnerability, trust, and shared experiences. The brain rewards this process with dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin, creating feelings of bonding and attachment. When pornography becomes a regular and chronic part of someone's life, it begins to interfere with this natural circuitry, altering how the brain perceives intimacy, how the body responds to sexual cues, and how relationships are valued. One of the key players in this process is oxytocin, sometimes referred to as the bonding hormone. Oxytocin is released during moments of physical touch, emotional closeness, and sexual activity with a partner. It strengthens social bonds, deepens trust, and reinforces the sense of safety in human connection. Pornography, however, bypasses this natural system. Instead of oxytocin-driven bonding with another human, the brain is conditioned to associate arousal and reward with screen-based imagery. Over time, this shifts the center of gravity for intimacy away from relationships and towards solitary digital experiences. Dopamine also plays a role here because it ties reward to novelty. In the context of relationships, novelty exists, but it's balanced with familiarity, stability, and emotional depth. With pornography, novelty is essentially endless. Every new image or video represents a new partner, a new scenario, and a new surge of dopamine. The brain learns to link arousal with constant change, making the slower, steadier rhythm of real relationships seem less stimulating. This can create difficulty sustaining interest in a long-term partner, not because the partner is lacking, but because the brain has been recalibrated to expect variety and intensity on demand. This effect can extend beyond the bedroom. Chronic pornography use can alter the way individuals perceive attraction, intimacy, and even human interaction in everyday life. Eye contact, casual touch, or emotional closeness may not produce the same level of reward because the brain has learned to expect exaggerated cues from pornography. Some people report feeling detached from partners, struggling to connect emotionally, or finding real intimacy less satisfying compared to digital experiences. These changes are not simply psychological, they are rooted in the rewiring of neural pathways that link arousal, reward, and human connection. Another layer of complexity is the impact on sexual performance and satisfaction. Studies have shown that excessive pornography use is correlated with sexual dysfunction, including difficulty achieving or maintaining arousal in real-life encounters. This is not due to physical inability, but rather to the mismatch between what the brain has been conditioned to expect and the reality of human intimacy. When the brain is wired to respond to high intensity, rapid novelty, a single partner and the natural pace of intimacy may not be enough to trigger the same response. This disconnect can create frustration in relationships, reduce confidence, and generate a cycle of avoidance where pornography becomes the preferred outlet because it feels easier and more reliable. Over time, these changes can reshape expectations about what intimacy means. Instead of seeing relationships as spaces for growth, connection, and shared meaning, the brain can begin to interpret them through the lens of performance and stimulation. Partners may feel objectified, or the emotional dimension of intimacy may be overshadowed by the pursuit of physical gratification. This can erode trust, reduce empathy, and create barriers to authentic connection. The individual may feel increasingly isolated, relying more heavily on pornography for comfort or release, while relationships weaken or become sources of tension. From a neuroscience perspective, this is a classic example of how repeated exposure to a stimulus reshapes perception and behavior. Just as someone who constantly consumes ultra-processed food can lose appreciation for the subtle flavors of natural food, someone who regularly consumes pornography can lose appreciation for the nuanced, slower, and deeply rewarding aspects of real intimacy. The rewiring of reward circuits and bonding systems shifts the brain's frame of reference, altering not just how arousal is experienced, but how relationships are valued on the whole. One of the most well-documented features of the brain's reward system is its ability to adapt to repeated stimulation. This adaptation is what neuroscientists call tolerance, and it occurs when the same stimulus no longer produces the same effect. Tolerance is not unique to pornography. It's the same process that underlies drug addiction, gambling, and even excessive use of social media. But pornography is uniquely potent in generating tolerance because it combines novelty, intensity, and accessibility in ways that the brain was never evolutionarily prepared to handle. When someone first consumes pornography, the brain responds with a spike in dopamine. This surge creates a strong association between the stimulus and pleasure, reinforcing the behavior and motivating future use. But with repeated exposure, dopamine receptors in the brain become less sensitive. The brain downregulates its response, meaning the same amount of pornography no longer produces the same intensity of reward. To recapture that initial feeling, the individual often seeks more of it either through longer viewing sessions, more frequent use, or content that is more extreme or novel. This pattern is identical to what we see in substance tolerance. For example, someone who drinks alcohol regularly may need more drinks over time to feel the same level of intoxication. Similarly, someone who uses pornography frequently may find that content they once found stimulating no longer produces the same effect. As a result, they escalate. They explore new categories, new levels of intensity, or scenarios they would not have considered before. This escalation is not necessarily a reflection of personal preference or values. It is the brain's way of chasing dopamine in a system that has grown less responsive to previous levels of stimulation. The cycle of tolerance and escalation can have wide-ranging consequences. First, it can distort perception of what is arousing or desirable. What starts as mild or mainstream content can progress into forms of stimulation that are detached from real-world intimacy, creating unrealistic expectations about sex and relationships. This shift in preferences is not simply a matter of choice, but of neural conditioning. The brain is adapting to increasingly extreme stimuli, carving new pathways that reinforce those patterns while weakening circuits tied to natural, everyday arousal cues. Second, tolerance contributes to compulsive use. Because the brain is no longer satisfied with earlier levels of stimulation, the urge to consume more becomes stronger and harder to resist. This can lead to repeated cycles of binging, where individuals spend extended periods watching pornography, often followed by feelings of guilt, shame, or exhaustion. These emotional responses can reinforce the cycle because shame and stress themselves can become triggers for further consumption as a form of escape. The brain begins to link pornography not only with arousal, but also with coping, making the habit even more deeply ingrained. Another important aspect of tolerance is the way it changes the baseline of motivation. As the brain becomes accustomed to high peaks of dopamine from pornography, normal experiences produce less impact by comparison. Simple pleasures like enjoying a meal, spending time with friends, or pursuing hobbies may feel dull. Even achieving long-term goals can feel anticlimactic because the dopamine release from those achievements pales in comparison to the spikes induced by pornography. This relative dullness reinforces the cycle of consumption as the brain seeks out the one stimulus that still produces a significant effect, even if that effect is diminished compared to the past. From a neuroscience perspective, tolerance is the natural outcome of pushing the dopamine system beyond its designed limits. Dopamine evolved to motivate survival behaviors like hunting, gathering, building social bonds, and reproduction. These behaviors involve effort, uncertainty, and delayed gratification. Pornography short-circuits that system by offering immediate, effortless, and repeatable surges of dopamine. But because the brain cannot sustain those surges indefinitely, it adapts by lowering sensitivity, creating the paradox where more consumption is required to feel less satisfaction. The result is a feedback loop. Tolerance drives escalation. Escalation further rewires the brain, and the rewiring deepens the reliance on pornography as the main source of stimulation. Over time, this loop can feel inescapable, not because the individual lacks willpower, but because their brain has been conditioned at a fundamental level to pursue stronger and stronger stimuli while devaluing everything else. The most important thing to understand about the brain is that it is not fixed. It is constantly changing in response to experience, behavior, and environment. This property, known as neuroplasticity, is both the reason pornography can so powerfully reshape reward systems and the reason recovery from its effects is entirely possible. The same mechanisms that allow harmful patterns to take hold are the very mechanisms that can be harnessed to rewire the brain in healthier, more sustainable ways. When someone reduces or eliminates pornography consumption, the brain begins to recalibrate. Dopamine receptors that had been downregulated due to overstimulation slowly regain sensitivity. Baseline levels of dopamine begin to normalize, allowing everyday activities to feel rewarding again. This process does not happen overnight. Depending on the frequency and intensity of prior use, the adjustment period can take weeks or even months. During that time, it is common to experience withdrawal, like symptoms such as irritability, low mood, or decreased motivation. These are not signs of permanent damage, but rather evidence that the brain is in the process of rebalancing itself. The key to recovery lies in deliberate replacement. The brain does not simply erase old circuits, it builds new ones through repeated practice. This is where discipline becomes critical. Engaging in behaviors that produce moderate, healthy dopamine release helps retrain the reward system. Exercise is a powerful example. It produces dopamine in a way that promotes motivation, resilience, and neurogenesis. Learning a skill, practicing meditation, or pursuing meaningful social connections also strengthens circuits that support long-term satisfaction rather than short-term spikes. Over time, these activities carve new pathways in the brain, gradually overshadowing the circuits linked to pornography. Another important factor in recovery is stress regulation. Many people turn to pornography not only for arousal, but also as a way to cope with stress, boredom, or loneliness. This makes the habit more deeply ingrained because it becomes associated with emotional relief. To break this cycle, the nervous system must learn new ways of handling stress. Practices like breath work, cold exposure, and mindfulness meditation have been shown to recalibrate stress responses and reduce the compulsion to seek instant gratification. By teaching the body and brain to tolerate discomfort without escaping into dopamine-driven behaviors, these practices strengthen resilience and self-control. Sleep and nutrition also play a surprisingly large role in this process. Poor sleep disrupts dopamine regulation, making cravings stronger and self-control weaker. Consistent, high-quality sleep allows the brain to reset its reward pathways more effectively. Nutrition impacts dopamine as well, particularly through amino acids like tyrosine, which is a building block for dopamine synthesis. Supporting the brain with proper rest and fuel creates the physiological foundation for neuroplastic change. One of the most powerful tools for recovery is social connection. Human beings are wired for bonding, and oxytocin released through real relationships counterbalances the dopamine-driven isolation of pornography use. Spending time with friends, cultivating trust in romantic partnerships, and engaging in meaningful community interactions activate reward circuits that are sustainable and fulfilling. These experiences remind the brain that intimacy and connection in the real world are deeply rewarding, even if they do not provide the same rapid intensity as digital stimulation. Over time, the slower, deeper rewards of authentic connection become more satisfying as the brain's sensitivity is restored. Neuroplasticity does not operate passively, it requires repetition and consistency. Just as repeated exposure to pornography wires the brain to expect certain patterns, repeated exposure to healthier behaviors wires the brain in new directions. Discipline is the bridge that makes this possible. Discipline is not about deprivation for its own sake, but about creating the conditions in which the brain can reset. By deliberately choosing environments and routines that minimize temptation and maximize engagement in positive activities, individuals can accelerate the rewiring process. What begins as effortful and even uncomfortable eventually becomes automatic. This is the essence of neuroplasticity. Circuits that are reinforced grow stronger, while circuits that are unused weaken. With time, the cravings diminish, motivation for real-world pursuits returns, and intimacy regains its natural place as one of the most rewarding human experiences.